Welcome back, everyone. We're going to continue looking at some different types of scales that you can play around with in music that you are creating. So, last time we talked through the modes, quote unquote, the church modes. Of course, there's a lot of history that goes into that. If you're using them in the context of Renaissance counterpoint or medieval style, it's going to act very differently than when you're working with a contemporary composition. I'm simply interested here in giving you some interesting pitch collections that you can arrange into scales that you can experiment in creating your own music. So that's, again, the purpose of this. So last time we were exploring some of these pitch collections. We discovered these modes, which I've arranged here in a sequence of lowered notes, starting with the most raised notes and then going to the most lowered notes as a spectrum from left to right, starting with Lydian, Ionian, Mixolydian, Dorian, then Aeolian. The Ionian was our quote-unquote major mode. The Aeolian is our natural minor mode, which can also be modified to create harmonic minor with a raised 7th scale degree, or natural minor. Change my pen color. It sounds like this. Going up, then going down, it sounds different. Then going on to Phrygian, and then finally Locrian. So that's what we looked at in the previous video. I leave these up here because I want to have a nice reference to them when we talk about them again. But for right now, these are our primary heptatonic pitch collections. Heptatonic scales, modes, pitch collections, depending on what term you want to use for what context you're in. So heptatonic, meaning that they have 7 pitch class scales. Okay, so there is another set of interesting sort of modes that we can create with this, and that's actually using the natural minor mode. The natural minor set of pitches can be rearranged to create some really interesting pitch collections. So we're going to do the same thing that we did with our modes, but rather than starting with a major scale, we're going to start with the natural minor scale. Or excuse me, not natural minor, our upwards melodic minor. And just like we did with the modes where we could start with successive pitches, we're going to do that. So if we did that, we could have this pitch collection, which again is unique. It's not going to be like our other. It's not going to be like our other pitch collections. It's not like a Phrygian scale because it has this this whole tone collection up on top. These are going to be sort of unique arrangements of these pitch collections. Then we could start here on this E flat. I'm going to do away with the naturals for now. This sounds like this. Quite cool with all these whole tones down at the bottom, before going back up and resolving up to that E flat. Really interesting scale there. Then going on to this scale, sounds like this. This scale has a specific name. This is sometimes known as the overtone scale, because when translated into equal temperament pitches, these pitches that are present will be the pitches that are lowest down on in the overtone series for this starting note. This is also sometimes known as the Lido-Mixian scale, because the bottom part of it sounds like a Lydian scale, while the top part of it sounds like a Mixolydian scale. We have this raised 4th scale degree, but this lowered 7th scale degree. So we sort of combine those two. So if you hear someone talking about the overtone scale or the Lido-Mixian scale, that's what they're referring to. Oftentimes we see this most famously in Bartók, but it's also present in lots of other music and is really quite cool. Going onwards, we can start on G, and it sounds like this. Really interesting combination of colors there. We can start on A, and it sounds like this. Feels slightly like the Aeolian scale, but this 5th is low, which also makes it feel a little bit like a Locrian scale. Really quite funky there. And then lastly, I'll squeeze it in here. If we start on B, it would sound like this. Interesting sets of possibilities that we have here. So this is another thing that you can play around with. Even if you're creating your own scale, try playing around with what pitch is actually sort of the final, which pitch is the one that we emphasize, that we arrive on, and that can help us discover some different colors. So these include a variety of our heptatonic scales. However, there are some other amounts of pitch collections that we can explore, namely some pentatonic scales, some hexatonic scales, and some octatonic scales. So let's talk about pentatonic scales. You may be familiar with a pentatonic pitch collection that sounds like this. A lot of folk music is often pentatonic. There's some theories based around the fact that these conform to some of the lower pitches within the harmonic series, the overtone series, and that could play a role certainly, but I'm not going to get into that right now. So we can hear these emphasized in two ways, either with this collection of 3 pitches on the bottom or with the collection of 2 pitches at the bottom. Or we could hear it this way. So depending on how we hear it will help to determine, does this C sound like the final note, or does this G sound like the final note? A lot of it has to do on emphasis and the construction of the melody. If we wanted to sort of transpose this, so that we had the 2 pitches on the bottom, it would look like this. 2 and then 3. And the makeup here that we're dealing with is, for this type of pentatonic scale, this is known as an anhemitonic. This basically means no half steps. So in this type of pentatonic scale, we have whole steps going on here. I'll erase this. This is kind of extra for right now. We have whole steps, and then these whole step groupings are separated by a minor third. So that is perhaps one of the most commonly heard whole tone scales that we might, pentatonic scales that we might associate with. Or if we shift it around. Both of these constructed out of the same sort of intervallic material. Sets of whole steps separated by minor thirds. Now you can have hemitonic pentatonic scales. That is certainly possible too. And there's a variety of these. And so again, this is not exhaustive. This is just going to give you a few ideas that you can play with. So here are a couple hemitonic pentatonic scales. So this one has a whole step and a half step and a whole step. This would sound like this. This one has a whole step and a half step and a half step here. Very different feels. You can, of course, you could add other pitches to this. Maybe you could add a D flat here. Starts to sound mysterious to me. You could add a flat here. That one actually sounds quite bright to me. There's sort of a Lydian quality to that. Again, here's me using that term brightness, which I said earlier that I don't necessarily subscribe to. But we all have our tendencies. So these are some pentatonic scales for you to play around with. Other ways that you could play around is change what interval separates the groupings here. Maybe you could play around with this and say, well, maybe I'm going to separate it like this. That starts to sound sort of like an arpeggiated chord, but there's nothing telling you that you can't do that. I'll put a question mark there. That's just one that I was coming up with randomly. You could also play around with, maybe there are some augmented seconds in there. Something like this. The issue with that is, as we, the nice thing about these other scales so far is they've always had thirds separating their groupings. So that's something that we often hear in pentatonic scales. This one that I just came up with here has a fourth. That's a little funky. Maybe instead I'll create this. I'll make this G into a G sharp. Then that G sharp up to C is kind of like an A flat up to C. So it sounds like a third. Sounds like this. That might be an interesting one to explore. So there's lots of different possibilities that we can have here with the pentatonic scale. When you hear someone talk about the pentatonic scale, they're likely referring to this anhemitonic pentatonic scale, but there's tons of other ones that exist, and I encourage you to explore those. Some other interesting scales that we can create are our hexatonic scales. Hexatonic means 6 pitch classes. So the most common hexatonic scale that is referred to is the whole tone scale. The whole tone scale is referred to because it is made entirely of whole steps. Now this last leap here, A sharp up to C, when we're dealing with the hexatonic scale, it doesn't map well necessarily onto our dodecatonic keyboard, dodecatonic meaning 12 pitches. So you sometimes have enharmonicism. This is just chromatic respelling. So that means we could have a B flat equaling this A sharp. So G sharp up to A sharp, still a whole step, A sharp up to C. In this case, we are hearing it as a whole step. If we saw an A sharp to C in the context of let's say a piece from the classical era, Baroque era, we would interpret it differently. But in this case, we're assuming some enharmonicism. So our whole tone scale sounds like this. Because this is all whole steps, it is known as symmetrical. That means that you could start on any one of these pitches and you'd still have the same array. If you, let's say you started on D and you went up and you did sort of that modal transformation that we were doing. We went from D to D with all of these whole steps. it would still be the same collection of pitches, the same collection of intervals, rather. Now, when we did that up here with our modes, we found that we would have 7 different transformations. So 7 different transformations if we transposed it. So because of this, there's a composer, Olivier Messiaen. Messiaen will sometimes call these types of scales, he refers to them as modes of limited transposition. And really what he's referring to here is modes of limited transposition compared to quote-unquote normal. I won't say normal. Compared to major mode transformations. So compared to those, these scales are limited. They have limited transformation. That doesn't mean that they're bad. It just means that they're actually really good at creating sort of perhaps an otherworldly feel. Because it's symmetrical, we don't necessarily know where the ending point is. There's no one interval pushing us in one direction. So we could just change it depending on what we emphasized. I started with C, but maybe I start to emphasize E. And I change that. So it can all be made with emphasis. Now, one thing to note is that technically there are only two possible such scales. One that includes the pitch C natural and one that includes the pitch D flat or C sharp. So here we have all our whole steps. And here this upper D flat basically equals a C sharp. So we have B up to C sharp. So in the context of equal temperament, of an equal temperament keyboard with 12 chromatic pitches, we can only have two possible whole tone scales. That's because if we count up these pitches here, we have half the pitches available to us on a 12-note keyboard. C, D, E, F sharp, G sharp, A sharp. And over here, for this other scale, we have the other 6 pitches. You combine those together, you get all those pitches, you get all the pitches of the chromatic scale. So all whole tone scales that you will see that are purely whole tone scales and are conforming to what's available on the piano will either be this pitch collection or this pitch collection. So those are our possibilities. Those are our possibilities here. But again, you could start on any one of these pitches. You could start on G and go on up to create that sort of feel. All right. So we've talked about pentatonic. That's 5 pitch classes. We've talked about one example of a hexatonic scale. There's other ones, but again, they're a little bit less standard. So I'd invite you to maybe come up with some of your own hexatonic scales. One that I'm going to randomly write could be this. Now the issue with that is that it actually starts to feel like that little Mixian scale, just with a note left out, because we've got that leap in there. So that's one of the issues with creating this sort of hexatonic thing, is that the whole tone scale is the one that sounds most like a scale without pitches left out. But you could certainly experiment with your own pitch collections. And so we're going to talk about octatonic scales, and then I'm just going to briefly mention a few things that you should maybe keep in mind as you're creating your own scales. So we talked about pentatonic, those are 5 pitch classes. Hexatonic, those are 6 pitch classes. Heptatonic, those are 7. And octatonic are going to be 8 pitch classes. So when we get to octatonic, we are squeezing in an additional pitch, more than we're used to hearing in our quote-unquote typical major or minor scales. So the octatonic scales are often divided into two sets. And a typical octatonic scale could look something like this. Octatonic scales that we frequently see are going to be made up of groups of whole steps and half steps, just like we've seen before. So here are our whole steps. And then down below, I'm going to mark the half steps. So the octatonic scale here is going to be one whole step, followed by a half step, followed by a whole step. Going up and down. Now, this is known, so this model of the octatonic scale is known as the whole half scale, because it's a whole step followed by a half step. Very creative terminology there. As you may expect, we can reverse that. So we can start with a half step and continue with a whole step here. And then going on to half steps. You will often find yourself using funky spellings as you're doing so. Here are our whole steps, and down below are our half steps, at least as I mark them. So this one, as you might expect, is known as the half whole. Be careful when you say that. Don't say that too fast. And then we will play that through. It sounds like this. Octatonic scale is really interesting. You can hear this. There's a lot of music. This is, I should say, it's often referenced in music that comes out of late 19th century and early 20th century Russia. So Stravinsky, sometimes people will hear this in some of his music, not all of it. Stravinsky or Bartok, sometimes also in the music of Rimsky-Korsakov, you'll hear some of this. It's also sometimes known as the diminished scale. It's known as the diminished scale because it's essentially the mapping of two fully diminished seventh chords. You could map two fully diminished seventh chords and you'd create this scale. So if I put these two chords together, C, E flat, F sharp, A, and D, F, A flat, B, and went back and forth between them, then I'd actually have this scale up here. Likewise, if I had this diminished seventh chord and went back and forth between them, and then I'd have this scale here. So that's why sometimes you'll hear it referred to in that context of a diminished scale. The interesting thing about this scale is unlike the whole tone scale, where you couldn't get any major or minor triads. If you built a triad in the whole tone scale, you're only going to get augmented triads. In the octatonic scale, you can still get major and minor triads. And so oftentimes if people want to have sort of a colorful approach to using triadic harmony, sometimes they will include this. So for instance, if we took this scale here and we could build a C major chord, we've got C, E, and G. We could build an E flat major chord, E flat, G, and B flat. We could build a F sharp major chord. We've got F sharp here, we've got B flat, and we've got D flat. F sharp, B flat, D flat, or as we would more like to see it, F sharp, A sharp, C sharp. So you can create some interesting harmonies here. Those are chromatic mediant relationships, if you're familiar with those. And if you're not, that's okay. I've got a video on those that you can watch. Basically, chords that are related by third, but where neither of them appear naturally in the other's key. So you can create some really interesting harmonies here. I want to reference one more spelling of the octatonic scale right here that I have chosen starting on D. These are the three possible octatonic pitch collections when it comes to alternating between whole steps and half steps. And what I mean by that is basically if I were building an octatonic scale, there's only, using this method, there are only three possible pitch collections that I'm going to create. Either this one, or this one. And that's just based on the math that's involved in an equal temperament system alternating between whole steps and half steps. If, for instance, if I started on D and proceeded with a half step like this and alternated between half steps and whole steps, all I would be doing is recreating this. But if I started on D and started with a whole step, half step, whole step, I'd be recreating this. Meanwhile, if I started on D flat, let's back up a little bit. If I started on D flat and started with whole steps and alternated whole and half, I'd be recreating this scale, or rather this pitch collection. There's that D flat and E flat and the E and F sharp. Meanwhile, if I started on D flat and started going by half step, D flat, I'll spell it as D natural, then E, then F. So I have a half step, whole step, then a half step. I would actually be creating this system down here. C sharp, and then D, and then going up to E, and then F. So these are our three possible pitch collections for this type of octatonic scale. So I do want to say that there's plenty of other scales out there for you to create and explore. There's some methods that I've tried experimenting with. I've tried to create my own decatonic scale. If you're interested, you can listen to my piece Colonnades. And this, it was less of a scale and more of an approach to pitch collections, and creating some effects out of that. This was an approach. The approach that I used was for the length of the thing. This is about a 90-minute composition. For all of it until the last movement, I left out the pitches F and C. And then it's only in the last movement that you hear the F and the C come back in. Unless I hit some wrong notes, in which case there might be a stray F and C in there. But the point was that I would just use this pitch collection, and sort of there would be this revelatory moment at the end where the F and the C came in. There's some other things going on in that piece that I hope make it interesting, but if you're interested to hear my approach to that, then you can take a listen to Colonnades. Another piece that I was playing around with some of these formations is Welkin harmony, or sky music, essentially. Welkin is the sort of Old English term for the heavens. And in this, one of the things I was interested in was playing around with colors. So starting down here with sort of a trichord, 3 notes of the major scale, and then going up and having the next 3 notes of a major scale. So this is sort of major scale, first 3 notes, a half step in between, and then going up like this. So there was always a half step in between, and then the first 3 notes of the next major scale in the pattern. And so this actually created, now this many people would not refer to as a scale because it extends more than an octave. But it was sort of this kaleidoscopic approach to pitch collections. So that within a region you're in sort of this, within a certain color of pitch collections. So there's lots of different ways that you can go about playing around with some of these with creating your own pitch collections and how you're using them. But hopefully, I hope that going through these different types of scales and modes, our heptatonic ones, our pentatonic ones, hexatonic, and then our octatonic modes, gives you some ideas for ways to play around with your own pitch collections. Enjoy!